so much for having me. So I'm excited to be here, and I'll admit, of course, that I don't know the answer to the question of whether condensed matter physics has a replication crisis. And I am going to be drawing a lot on psychology in my talk as kind of a case study or an example of a field where we did turn out to have quite a big problem when we looked. And I'll try to answer the question of, how would a field go about assessing itself, and if it's worried that it might have a replication crisis. So I want to start with, I'm sure you've all heard of this idea that there are concerns about replication in psychology. It's been covered quite a bit by the media. And I want to point out one thing, which is that was alluded to by Brian, that it's not just psychology, that there's evidence in economics and other social sciences, and also very importantly in the biomedical sciences. In some ways, a crisis in the biomedical sciences has been known about for longer and going on for longer. And I want to kind of boil down the problem. It's not just about replication, and we'll talk about the difference between replication and reproducibility and so on in a bit, but really fundamentally to me, it's a problem of misrepresentation, of the literature just not being what it seems. So if we oversimplify and we talk about, the results of empirical studies should look quite messy, they shouldn't always be perfect, but what we end up with in the literature is something where everything looks like it works, everything looks much better than it really should. And so given the time, I'm going to, go through this relatively quickly of how we go from having results that should look like the first picture, but end up with a literature that looks like the second, and how we managed to do that in psychology without even realizing the extent to which we were doing it and what some of the causes of that are. So first, some evidence that the published literature does look unbelievable. This is just a very quick and dirty summary of the proportion of results in different fields that are positive results. So in the case of psychology, that would be statistically significant results, p less than 0.05, but it could mean different things. Like you found evidence supporting the research hypothesis, not null results, not negative results. And so you can see that this varies across disciplines and that psychology is at the very bottom. So there's some reason to think that things are worse in psychology. And I'll be the first to admit that I doubt there are many fields that are quite as bad as we found ourselves in psychology. But I think the point, lest it sounds like I'm throwing my field under the bus, I do think that there are reasons to worry across many, many fields. Many of the risk factors and the problems that we turned up in psychology, we didn't know were there before, and we were pretty confident, we would have confidently said weren't there. And I think that's true in many other fields, that without looking, you would have no reason to think you have a problem. But B, many of the risk factors are there. So even though psychology is the worst in terms of having over 90%, many estimates suggest 95% of our published findings are positive results, it's still quite high across many, many fields. And I would suspect that many people have anecdotes about difficulties publishing negative results or results that are inconsistent with the established literature and so on. Possibly for good reason in some cases, but I think that the barriers to publishing those kinds of results are too high, and it leads to a literature that just doesn't reflect reality, and that when we go and test it and see if things are replicable and reproducible, we're likely to be disappointed. So how did we achieve this in psychology? And I think the nuts and bolts of this probably look different in different fields, so I won't go into a great amount of detail. But it's not that hard, looking back on it, it is a little bit embarrassing that we didn't realize the extent of the problems, because we were often training our PhD students, teaching these practices, not so much, not the textbook practices that we teach undergraduates, but, we would train our students to explore their data and then to rewrite the paper around the most exciting result and frame it as if that had been the point all along. So now that's a practice that we called harking, or hypothesizing after the results are known. So maybe you aim for a particular target, you had a particular research hypothesis in mind, you missed that, but what you do hit is interesting, so you move the target and say that that was what you were studying all along. And that might seem like a minor detail. We rewrite the intro, we write a different intro than we would have otherwise, but it certainly makes us look like better shots than we are. And it leads to shock and disappointment when things don't replicate, don't hold up, because we had framed it as if this was theoretically driven, as if this was planned. We had, statistical error control in place if we planned it, and so on. When that's not the case, the results are much less likely to hold up. So that's one of the ways, harking, but there are many others. So you might have heard of things like p-hacking, which again, I won't go into too much detail because I suspect that looks different in different fields. In our field, p-hacking means rerunning analyses in order to get the p-value below 0.05, because that is the criterion for positive result and publishability in our field. And we don't necessarily know that we're doing this. It's not super obvious. And it might sound crazy that as behavioral scientists, we were unaware that our behaviors might have been motivated by things like confirmation bias. But very often the kinds of things we did in p-hacking are very justifiable from a theoretical and methodological perspective. So you get a wonky result you didn't expect, you go back and look at the data, you see some outliers, or you see that something was miscoded and so on. In some of those cases, of course, you should rerun the analysis. And then it becomes a gray area from the, of course, you should rerun the analysis cases to the, okay, now you're just overfitting, like plainly overfitting. And it's very easy to slide down that slope. So all of those kind of reanalyses with different specifications in order, not necessarily consciously in order to get the result you want, but you stop when you get the result you want. And you publish that one and you don't report the other ones. That's what we mean by p-hacking. And then other ways to make the literature look better than it is are things like file drawing. So this is when the researcher, if you can't p-hack it into significance, or you have more integrity than that, you might just not report the studies that didn't work. You convince yourself that, oh yeah, that experimenter is incompetent, I'm not going to report that study, I'm going to report the other studies that did work. And then publication bias is when that bias, that kind of sweeping under the rug of the studies that didn't work, comes from the journals, or the reviewers and editors tell you to drop that study because it makes the paper less neat and tidy and so on. So these biases, we're kind of all in on it, and we all give ourselves good reasons why it's okay to misrepresent, and we don't think we're misrepresenting, but it's okay to show only the best results because we think those are the real ones. So why bore people with the experiments that didn't work or with the analyses that don't show the effect? A couple of years ago, there was some journalism about this in Wired. They were talking about p-hacking, and they interviewed one of the authors who coined the term p-hacking, Joe Simmons, and he really emphasized how this is not something you go in thinking, I'm going to p-hack now, I'm going to make my results look better than they really are. It's something that happens very naturally and not without bad intentions. And so he says, p-hacking isn't necessarily nefarious behavior, but rather a human one, and one that the authors who came up with this term have been guilty of, and I have been guilty of many times over as well. They say at its core, p-hacking is really about confirmation bias, the human tendency to seek and preferentially find evidence that confirms what we'd like to believe, while turning a blind eye to things that might contradict our preferred truths. It sounds like some kind of immoral behavior, and that's not helpful. That people don't understand the inevitability of p-hacking in the absence of safeguards against it. They think p-hacking is something that evil people do, and since we're not evil, we don't have to worry about it. But Simmons says that p-hacking is a human default. It's something that every single person will do, that I continue to do when I don't take safeguards against it, like pre-registering my studies. Without safeguards in place, he knows it's almost impossible to avoid. And this has been my experience too, even since becoming fully aware and appreciating its bias on my results is very, very hard to avoid. And I have to not trust myself. Like the first step, right? And Feynman is one of the people who said this, I'm sure you're all aware, that the first step is to not fool yourself and to fully come to terms with how susceptible we are to these biases. And when we looked for safeguards in psychology, we realized that we don't have them. And if anything, we exacerbate these tendencies. So there's this problem where researchers are susceptible to confirmation bias. They already believe their theory. They believe the results that confirm their theory more than the results that don't. So if they get results that don't confirm their theory, they're going to scrutinize them more. And journals select the prettiest results. They want the exciting things. They want the positive results and so on. And so bad research practices are rewarded without anybody necessarily having bad intentions. And this leads to, as we call it, a vicious cycle. But I think it's really important to point out that nobody needs to have bad intentions here. Everybody can fully believe themselves, the authors and the editors and reviewers, to be committed to the truth. And one of the simple fact that we have 90+% significant or positive results in our literature is one of the pieces of evidence that things have gotten quite out of control. But now we have more meta-scientific evidence since this crisis has come to light. We've done more and better meta-science looking at how bad the problem is. And one piece of evidence comes from a new kind of literature, which is called registered reports, where authors submit their paper before they collect the data, and the editors and reviewers review the research plan, the analysis plan, and everything. And if they deem the study to be a high quality study that's important to run and important to know the results of, the authors get an in principle acceptance from the journal before collecting the data and knowing the results. But everybody is committed to publishing the paper regardless of the results. So this closes many of the doors to p-hacking, to harking, to selective publication bias. And so we can compare that literature where there's a lot less room for bias to the traditional literature, where we know that 90 to 95% of results are positive or significant. So this is an analysis across several disciplines that have registered reports. So first, looking at traditional literature, not registered reports, but regular papers, we already know something like 80 to 95% of articles find positive results, very few are negative results. But in the registered report literature, so among these select papers, and there's not very many of them here, and this at the point that this analysis was done, I think there were around 100. For novel studies, only 45% find positive results, and a full 55% find negative results. And among just studies that are replications of earlier studies, and here by replication, I mean new data collection, but trying to follow the same methods and procedures as the original, only about a third find significant results, and 2/3 do not find evidence for the research hypothesis. So this is some indication of how bad the problem is, that when we kind of plug the holes and close the doors to many of these biases, we get quite different results. Now, there are other possible explanations for this, but I think that a very viable explanation is that many of those positive and significant results in literature are not true positives. So what happened in psychology? Let me talk a little bit more about the specifics of what happened in psychology and how I think we got there, and the lessons we've learned that I think might apply to other fields. So first, as I mentioned, we have pretty good evidence now from meta-scientific research suggesting that the problem is quite big. There's this evidence I just showed you from registered reports, which is remarkably consistent with the results of replication attempts in psychology. So there have been a number now, dozens and dozens of attempts to replicate, sometimes dozens or hundreds of findings in psychology. And over again, they keep finding that a relatively small fraction of results can be replicated. And here again, I mean, collecting new data, seeing if we get consistent results. So across the studies I've been able to find where I think the standards are relatively high for the replications, about 45% of articles that are submitted to a replication attempt are successful, which is quite similar to the proportion of positive results in the much more controlled registered reports. So something like half of our results disappear when we put in more constraints and put in safeguards to see if those discoveries are true discoveries. We also have a reproducibility problem. This is, by reproducibility here, I mean trying to obtain the original data from the original study and reanalyze it and see if we get consistent results. So my colleague Tom Hardwick has done some research, for example, here, just trying to reanalyze data from one journal, 35 articles in one journal. And this is a journal that requires the authors to share their data in code. So already these are relatively high standards, and authors who are choosing to publish in a journal where for psychology, it's pretty rare to require data in code. So they have reason to be more careful with their code, to be more careful that their results are reproducible. And even here, Tom Hardwick and his colleagues had a hard time reproducing the results for many of the articles that they attempted to reproduce. But it's really not even just a replication and reproducibility crisis. The more worrying thing for me is not that these results looked bad when we looked, it's how long it took us to look, and for how long we were happy to just be confident that all these positive, too good to be true results were true. We put them in our textbooks, we put out press releases about them, and we kind of gave awards and built our credibility as a field around things that we should have been more suspicious of. And when I look back on how we let things get that bad, I think it's a few different things. One is just not having a culture of transparency. It was not the norm in our field for authors to be expected to post their data, their code, or even to post enough details about their method for someone else to independently replicate the study from scratch, which is quite shocking if you think about it. But we used excuses like page limits and boring and blah, blah, blah. And any competent researcher should be able to figure it out from the method section and so on. So it's quite embarrassing that we didn't even ask. But worse than that, I would say, is that we didn't think that asking was important, and we thought it was rude. We thought it would be impolite to ask another researcher for their data, that we, in psychology and in science, we trust each other, that science is based on a foundation of trust. And if we can't trust each other, then what do we have? And so on. But of course, that benefit of the doubt and that charity was extended more to some people than others. And what that meant in reality, if it was impolite to ask for data or impolite to question someone's results, was that the high status people got away with a lot, and anyone who wanted to come along and question that, tried to build on it and couldn't, that was only whispered about at conferences. And I kind of knew that that's how the world works. I wasn't that naive, but when I became editor-in-chief of a journal, I was shocked at just how openly that was discussed, this status bias. So after 1 year of being editor-in-chief, the publication committee who had hired me and who could fire me came to me and said that they were getting some grumbles from important people, that I was stepping on important people's toes. And when I asked for more evidence of, my bad editorial practices, they forwarded me an email from a well-respected, famous person in my field. They didn't tell me who, but a senior, highly respected, award-winning social psychologist. And the email said, about a month ago, I had an experience with Simine that I found extremely distasteful, and I won't submit to this journal again. And I asked, okay, but extremely distasteful is not exactly a scientific claim. Can we talk about the paper and my decision and what was wrong and so on? And I shouldn't have been as shocked as I was, but it really did come down a lot to, well, you're pissing off important people, so you must be doing something wrong. And I think it comes back to this not valuing transparency and not valuing criticism and critique, and making it okay to ask, is this finding true or not, or is it robust or not, et cetera, and having this culture of just giving the benefit of the doubt. And when we went and looked, yes, things did look quite bad. So we found a lot of unforced errors in statistical reporting, lots of other things like that, that it made me realize, like, actually what we were doing in peer review at our prestigious journals was not picking the papers that are the most accurate, most robust, and so on. It was based on something else, because we didn't have a culture of poking and prodding and making sure that everything was there. And so those are the kinds of things that lead to a literature that's too good to be true, where, things don't look as they should. And yes, while it became called the replication crisis and so on, I think it really was much more fundamental than that. It was a credibility crisis based on a lack of transparency and a lack of culture of criticism, which I'll come back to in a minute. So one thing that was interesting to me in the aftermath of kind of discovering the problems, and I would say we're still in this crisis, so I'm not going to say the aftermath of the crisis, but it's now become well established in psychology that there are these problems, or at least these phenomena of lack of replicability and reproducibility and transparency need to be explained. Not everybody agrees they're a problem. And one kind of spin on it, one approach to dealing with this problem is one I observed when I was on a National Academy of Sciences study committee on reproducibility and replicability. And I won't speak much about what happened during the process because that's confidential, but I can say that when the report came out, there was a chapter in that report on what should the public expect of science, how much error is normal in science, and so on. And in the end, I decided not to be a co-author of the report, partly because of my disappointment in how that chapter dealt with these questions of errors in science. So here's a quote from that chapter. I'm having trouble moving slides. So in that chapter, they write, the advent of new scientific knowledge that displaces or reframes previous knowledge should not be interpreted as weakness in science. And I agree with that. It sounds really nice, and most of the time it's true. But what this chapter and this quote, but also in my opinion, in the whole chapter and the whole report fails to grapple with is what kinds of errors are not okay in science. When have we gone too far? When have things gotten too bad that we can say this community, this discipline is, doesn't have the safeguards in place, is not acting responsibly, needs to change. And that's what I felt like. I don't know the answer to that question. How do we know that? But that's the question we need to be grappling with. It's not the question of, do we have no errors or some errors okay? Of course, some errors are okay. Of course, sometimes things won't replicate. But if we're not asking ourselves the question of how do we know if things are worse than they should be, if we're making unforced errors, if we're allowing things to get through that really shouldn't, if we're making the same errors over and over again, for example, if we're making errors that are very preventable, or if we're punishing and stifling criticism that would lead to a more accurate scientific record. A more kind of explicit and more specific to my field reaction to this replication crisis was some authors, very, very prestigious authors. So I don't know if you have this in physics, we have an annual review of psychology where it's by invitation only, and you kind of write a summary of the state of the field. And so some of the most eminent psychologists were asked to write about the state of psychology in the kind of peak years of the replication crisis in psychology. And so they wrote, all of this replication crisis is normal science, not crisis. A replication failure is not a scientific problem. It is an opportunity to find limiting conditions and contextual effects. Of course, new studies don't always replicate. And again, I agree with that in many cases. I think that is absolutely true in a healthy scientific discipline, but there is no burden here on the discipline to question itself and ask, are we a healthy scientific discipline with a normal amount of error, normal amount of self-correction, or have things gotten too bad? And in this case, I think my big beef with statements like this is that these statements are made by the very same people who, when the applications were coming out, when the problems were coming out, were not cheering and saying, hooray, this is science self-correcting. We're actually trying to create obstacles to this kind of work getting out there, the criticism getting out there. So the same people who are saying all of this is normal science, of course, science makes errors and it's good that we're fixing them, are also people who were using words and phrases like these. These are actual names that replicators and critics in psychology have been called during the replication crisis. There's only a very, very partial list. And my favorite is this one, accuracy fetishist. Sorry, the slides are advancing on their own. And I want to point, so one of the ones on this list is human scum. And that sounds, and I can laugh about it, but at the same time, I literally had a reporter call me and say, a famous social psychologist that you definitely know said about you, I think they're human scum. What do you have to say about that, right? So this has gotten very, very personal. And so it's a bit weird for these people to then turn around and say, let's pat ourselves on the back for being a self-correcting science, right? So one of the things that has come out for me is when I teach undergraduate research methods and I talk about scientific values and methods and so on, and science being self-correcting, I now feel a much harder burden of explaining, well, how do I know that our science is self-correcting? How do I know, what are we doing to make it self-correcting? And I'm not okay with just saying, this is normal science, any kind of error is okay. We often see the first few panels of this comic, but it doesn't go well if we stick with this line. So I've been, partly because I teach undergraduate research methods and wanted to have a better answer to this question of, I can't just stand up there and say, take my word for it, science is self-correcting. So how do we know? And I've been reading some philosophy of science and other work on this. And there's a historian of science, Naomi Oreskes, who I really enjoy a lot of her work. And she came out with a book in 2019 called Why Trust Science. And I was very excited to dig into this and see what she says about what makes science self-correcting. So she talks a lot about some of the values of science and how they're different than corporate values or other kinds of values. And so she gets to the point in the book where she's going to talk about, how do we know that science has these self-correcting mechanisms? And she says, well, we know the same way we know other empirical phenomena, we observe them. And she says, when we observe science, when we observe scientists, we find that they have developed a variety of practices for vetting knowledge, for identifying problems and attempting to correct them. And again, this sounds good, but it's very kind of generic and vague. And I was not very satisfied with this. I would like to find a more concrete answer of what are these mechanisms and how do we know they're there? And how would an outsider be able to tell if a field didn't have these safeguards and these mechanisms? We can't just take a field's word for it. We can't take, even as insiders of the field, we can't just rest on our laurels and be confident that we have these mechanisms if we can't point to them and say, here are the ways in which we encourage detecting errors and fixing them. And from someone in psychology and biophysiology, James Heathers, here's his take on the self-correcting mechanisms in science as someone who has identified many, 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 many errors in the published literature and tried to get them corrected. He says, in reality, mechanisms to correct bad science are slow, unreliably enforced, capricious, run with only the barest nod towards formal policy, confer almost no reward and sometimes punitive elements for a complainant who might use them. And this is my experience too. And I have to admit, as now having been editor of several journals, seeing things from the inside, I'm fully with the critics here who say that journals and editors often don't do their job, often don't take self-correction seriously. And not only do we not reward the people who point out errors and try to fix the record, but we often make life quite difficult for them. And so now when I teach research methods, I emphasize that this idea that science is self-correcting is a claim that needs to be tested in itself and something that needs to be supported with evidence. And science is self-correcting, sure, this is also James Heathers, when we correct it, not because of magical progress, right? So I've been working in recent years a lot on the kind of the practical side of philosophy of science, that if we want to make our field better, what should we do? How do we earn back our credibility? And so thinking about this question of why trust science, what makes science trustworthy? And here there's some useful information from social science surveys. So for example, Pew has done surveys of representative samples of adults in the US and also in other countries, but these data are from the US. And we know from the Pew data that trust in science is quite high and trust in scientists is quite high. So these are the green bars here over time. This doesn't go into the post-COVID era, but I think that the numbers may have dipped a bit, but still trust in scientists is quite high in the US and in many other countries around the world, and higher than or equal to basically any other institution, trust in any other institution. But interestingly, in those same surveys, they also ask respondents questions like, do you think that scientists are accurate and fair? Do you think that they admit their mistakes and take responsibility for them, and so on? And the public is not naive. So here's how they respond when asked if scientists admit and take responsibility for mistakes, for example. And so the green dot is the percent of respondents who agree that scientists admit and take responsibility for mistakes for different kinds of sciences. And you can see that it's fairly low. 10 to 20% of respondents agree that scientists admit and take responsibility for mistakes. In my opinion, that's completely accurate because scientists are human. And if we've learned one thing from behavioral and social sciences, it's that humans are not very good at admitting and taking responsibility for mistakes. So that's not why science is trustworthy. And the public trusts science, but at the same time is not naive about this. What makes science trustworthy is not that individual scientists are noble and superhuman and completely able to admit their mistakes. Instead, I think philosophers of science and sociologists of science are converging on the idea that what makes science trustworthy is something about how we check each other's work, about our social process. And this is something that actually a psychologist said a while ago. He said the dependability of scientific reports comes from a social process rather than from dependence upon the honesty and competence of any single experimenter. Organized distrust produces trustworthy reports. And organized distrust is an idea from the sociologist of science, Robert Merton. And so the idea here is that we don't count on each of us to be objective and accurate. We count on the social processes amongst each other to catch any problems. And so for that to work, we need two fundamental things, in my opinion. We need transparency. I'm not sure why this. Okay, we need transparency and we need this idea of organized distrust. And so to take a metaphor here, transparency would be like saying that you have to lift the hood on the car. You can't try to sell me a car without showing me what's inside. So if you want me to take your claim seriously, tell me all the details and show me the materials of what you needed to obtain those data, and then show me the data and the code that you used to analyze it, answer any questions that are reasonable questions that people might have about it, etc. So transparency is good. It means that you're not hiding anything, but it doesn't necessarily mean anyone's going in and checking it. What organized distrust means having a culture where you incentivize and reward people who actually go in and do the work of stress testing the important results and checking if they're robust and so on. And so what I would argue is that at least in the social sciences, where we've had this kind of replication crisis and this coming to terms with our problems, we've made quite a bit of progress on transparency. So in this pyramid of, the culture change that Brian Nosek made, where he talks about, the first steps are to make something possible, make it possible for people to share their data or to register their analysis plan ahead of time or other kinds of transparency. And then we move towards making it easy, making it normative, making it rewarding. In the social sciences, we're not yet at making it required, but we're working on it. And it won't always be required in every single case, but we're working towards making it the default, that we assume that someone should be transparent unless there's a good reason not to be. And this is important. It's been challenging even to get here. There's been a lot of resistance just to increasing transparency. A lot of like, why are you asking us this? Do you not trust us? We're creating a culture of distrust and things like that. And I think it's been really important here to go back to basic values and talk about, well, what do we tell the public and what do we tell our students? If we're not willing to be transparent, then what makes science different from any other kind of knowledge? So I think it's important here to really remember our roots, remember our commitments and our basic principles. And I think transparency is quite uncontroversial if you go back to those kind of basic values and foundations. So even though this was quite hard to get where we are in the social sciences on transparency, there was a lot of resistance, and we're still fighting a lot of these fights. We still have made quite a bit of progress, and that's good. But transparency is only the first step. And as Andrew Gelman has said, he has a great 2-page paper that I strongly encourage, especially for trainees. Honesty and transparency are not enough. Actually, not specifically for trainees. I think senior people need to hear this even more, but it's just a very easy paper to assign, very short. He says, consider the consequences for a researcher who eagerly accepts the message of ethical and practical values of sharing and openness, but does not learn about the importance of data quality. They could then just be driving very carefully into a brick wall, conducting transparent experiment after transparent experiment, and continuing to produce and publish noise. So just lifting the hood on the car doesn't mean that there's no problems. We need both transparency, but then we also need a culture of going in and checking those things and making sure that we care about quality, that we detect errors and fix them. And as hard as it was to get traction on transparency and make the progress we've made, I would argue that organized distrust is going to be even harder. And part of the problem here is just human character. As Kurt Vonnegut put it, another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. Many people go into science because they want to make discoveries, not because they want to fix other people's false discoveries. But it's worse than that. It's not just that it's maybe work that isn't at the top of all of our lists. We actively deter people from doing this kind of work, and there are disincentives to do it. So while we may be nearing the top of the pyramid on transparency. I would say on organized distrust, it's often not easy and sometimes even not possible. People try to correct the record and nobody listens, or they're kicked. Basically, the punishment is that they no longer are able to function in the field because they've become so unpopular. So how can we encourage more organized distrust? So if we want to say that as a field, we're fine, we don't have a replication crisis, we don't have a credibility problem, then we need to make sure that we're encouraging organized distrust, that we have a culture of it and that we reward it. And so here there's kind of different ways to think about it. I'm going to take this car metaphor too far. So in psychology, we have a little bit of physics envy. And so we developed something called the psychological science accelerator, borrowing from the concept of accelerators in physics. Part of the concept here is just to do really big team science to accomplish things that we wouldn't be able to with individual labs and individual PIs. But I also kind of like the metaphor of accelerating science, that part of the purpose of these kinds of big team approaches is to push the boundaries of science, to go further and faster than we could otherwise. And I think that's a very noble goal. We absolutely need that. But as we know, when we accelerate things, there's also the chance that things will crash and burn. And so we shouldn't just be going full speed ahead and not caring about, error control and quality control. So my argument is that any field that has functions to accelerate science should also have repair shops for broken or potentially problematic findings and so on. We need to have a place where we can take a finding that, let's say the field is running away with it, building on it, but it hasn't been stress tested yet. Where are we going to take it to do the stress testing to find out, is it generalizable? Is it robust? Is it, and again, the specifics of what that looks like will be different in different fields. But we have to have the infrastructure, not only in advancing and pushing the boundaries, but also have infrastructure for slowing down, checking, correcting, and having people who are rewarded for doing that well. One question is, who should do this work? And there's some argument that it should be part of, for example, early career training, that before we go on to do novel experiments, maybe we learn to replicate other experiments, and maybe those findings should make it out there when there's been some quality check on them and so on. I think one thing to think about is that it's really important who is in this dialogue about criticism and organized distrust. And this has been pointed out by many of the same philosophers of science who talk about how objectivity in science is achieved through this organized distrust, the social process. They talk about the importance of diversity in these communities of organized distrust. And this is, again, Naomi Oreskes, the historian of science, but she's talking about ideas by Helen Longino, a philosopher of science, where she says, the greater the diversity of a community, the greater the degree of objectivity it may be able to achieve as individual biases and background assumptions are outed. And here the idea is that if the critics have the same biases and blind spots as the authors and as each other, you're not going to catch all of the errors. In order to have really effective organized distrust and a community of criticism, you need people from different backgrounds with different blind spots, different assumptions, different theoretical commitments, but also different other kinds of commitments and experiences in order to have a better chance of detecting different problems and getting to a more accurate overall answer. So if we're going to make early career researchers do a lot of this work, and we're going to make people with different backgrounds and maybe from underrepresented groups do a lot of this work, then it's even more important that we protect and promote the people who do this work and not, impose a lot of penalties on people who detect errors and bring them to light. Felipe Romero is another philosopher of science who has a paper called Who Should Do Replication Labor, where he argues for a specialized career track. And I would say it applies not just to replication labor, but any kind of error detection and correction type of labor. And so he talks about what we would need to do in order to make this a viable career track. Right now, I think the incentives are such that it would be crazy for anyone to try to make a career, at least in psychology, and I suspect in many other fields, to make a career out of trying to make the published literature better, just identifying errors, identifying areas of improvement, and so on. But these are the people doing this are the people who allow us to sit in front of the public, in front of our students, and say science is self-correcting. We are committed to self-correction. So we need to be able to say that. I think that is a really fundamental value in science and a fundamental thing that makes science trustworthy and valuable. We should be able to pat ourselves on the back and say science is self-correcting. But if we're going to do that, we need to put our money where our mouth is and actually support and reward the people who allow us to be able to say that. And so I would say the takeaway from psychology's replication crisis, the main thing is that it's not that we had these problems, it's that we weren't looking for them, that we would have been defensive about the idea that we had these problems and that we didn't react so well when they were first brought to light. And I think if physics wants to learn from our mistakes, I would say cheer on the people trying to identify problems and trying to assess the state of the field, because those are the people who make it possible for you to say as a field that we're committed to self-correction, we're credible science committed to accuracy. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simine. That was a wonderful talk. We have some questions from the audience, which I will list the ones that are there. If people have more questions, I think you can use the hand raise feature. I think you can't unmute yourself without me doing it. So just raise your hand and we'll get to you. Let me start with the first question from Lee Smith, which is there a historical record on this question? Can we tell that the replication problems suddenly got worse, or were they there all along?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on some dimensions of, I'll take replication broadly. On some dimensions, there is a historical record. So for example, transparency. So we know that, for example, in psychology, it was extremely rare for authors to share their data. Part of that was just the technology wasn't there. It wasn't clear what it would have meant to share our raw data in the 1980s, for example. So we can track that things have gotten better. And even just since 2012, let's call that the beginning of the replication crisis in psychology, we can track that things have gotten a lot better in transparency. They're still very far from the ceiling, but they have gotten better. Other dimensions like replicability itself, I don't think there's a lot of data. There weren't audits of the replicability of psychology, at least prior to the first one that I know of was published in 2015. So part of what we're doing now is trying to do a lot of meta science to establish the baseline now, so that in the future we can repeat these same audits and see if things have improved. But looking backwards, I mean, psychology is a fairly young science, so it's a little bit harder to say, but there isn't a lot of meta scientific work prior to the crisis to know what things were like back then. Some things we can go back and code, like what kinds of methods, what sample size people were using, for example, is a big deal in psychology. We can go back and code that, and things have improved over the last few decades in psychology. But most of that work is only being done now. There wasn't meta-scientific work on that before.
Okay, thank you. Another question comes from Michael Weissman. He says, of the 2/3 of registered replication attempts that didn't pass the p less than 0.05 criterion, how many had actually statistically significant data from the original? So how much of the problem was just having different data versus looking at or treating the data differently, or drawing different conclusions from similar looking data?
Yeah, so many of the replication projects were careful not just to use a p less than 0.05 criterion, partly because many of the replication projects actually were much more highly powered statistically than the originals. So that almost was a meaningless criterion, because you could get a p less than 0.05 result and it'd be extremely inconsistent with the original. So there have been different kind of criteria and different people developing new kind of thresholds for what do we call consistent with the original. So that literature, I would say, is much more nuanced than I gave it credit for here. I would say the bottom line conclusion doesn't change if you use a different definition of replication success than p less than 0.05. And actually, over time, from 2015 to more recent replication attempts, the authors of the replications have gotten better at not just using that p less than 0.05 cutoff. So the discussions have increased in their sophistication, I would say.
Okay, maybe I can use my co-organizer privilege to sneak a question in myself here.
Sure.
I wonder how much of the business of addressing a replication problem comes down to just training people in more advanced statistical knowledge. Like, I think those of us in condensed matter don't really appreciate how hard it is to infer causality in a statistical sense. So how much of it was just psychology people needing to learn more statistics?
Yeah, I would say if learn more statistics includes things like understanding reasoning about causality, then yeah, I would agree. I think it depends how narrowly you define learn more about statistics. I think some of the problems are much more about research methods more broadly defined, understanding the difficulties, like how rare it should be that we make a claim that something is generalizable or that an effect is causal, or, there's many of these kind of grand claims that we think we can make just based on statistical, error control or something really a narrow definition of statistical validity, when in fact, there are all these threats to validity that come not just from statistical errors, but other kinds of errors in reasoning, errors in theorizing, and so on. So, I mean, I guess in a way that absolutely it comes down to not good enough training on validity and inference, but that's just science, right? Just we're not doing science well enough, I guess, is another way of saying that. So it's hard to argue with that. But it's complicated to say it comes down to training, because honestly, like what I found as editor is that the worst offenders are often the most senior people who in theory should have the most training and so on. Of course, it would be great if we could make the next generation much better. but it's almost pointing the finger in the wrong place to say that the trainees need to do better, because really we also need to figure out how to fix the problem from the top.
Okay, thank you. Another question here from Anna Akrap, who asks, what, if anything, can be done about status bias?
That's tough, but I think one thing I've been talking a lot about, because it's one of my passions, is that we in psychology, we talk a lot about wanting transparency from individual researchers, that they post their data, their code, et cetera. But we should also expect more transparency from the gatekeepers and the decision makers. So in my field, journals are quite reluctant even to name the handling editor on a paper. That should be completely uncontroversial. You should not be editing if you're not willing to make it public that you were the handling editor on a paper. And that would already start to bring to light potential conflicts of interest, or other problems in who's handling whose papers and so on. I think we should make the content of peer reviews public. Reviewers shouldn't have to sign their name to it if they don't want to, but what was in the review should be public, so that when a paper is published, everyone can see how thoroughly it was vetted. Did it seem like it was vetted thoroughly? Did it seem like maybe the reviewers were in cahoots with the authors and so on? I mean, that won't catch everything, because sometimes reviews look fine, but actually there was a conflict of interest or something like that. But at least it holds journals and decision makers more accountable. I'm quite shocked at the extent to which we've pushed for transparency from researchers, but we allow really big, important decisions to be made completely in secret. Now, of course, some secrecy is warranted. As I mentioned, I'm not for forcing reviewers to identify themselves. I think that the fear of retribution and so on is real. So sometimes there are good arguments for not being 100% completely transparent, but journals, professional societies, funders, et cetera, there's a lot more room for them to be more accountable for what they're doing and whether they have safeguards in place for status bias, for example. So what are their policies around conflicts of interest? Can editors publish in their own journals? And what happens if they submit to their own journals? That's another big avenue for corruption. So all these potential areas of status bias and corruption, we should ask our societies, our journals, our decision makers, what are you doing about it? And what can you show us to help us have more confidence that you're, doing something about this problem?
Okay, I have one more question from Aaron Hui, and I'm worried that you only have 1 minute to answer, and it's going to be a hard one. So do your best in 1 minute. His question is,
Okay,
how
I'll
does
try.
one build a proper incentive structure to fix replication problems? At the moment, it seems we have a method, but no real way to reward it or incentivize it.
Yeah, I mean, I would point you to Felipe Romero's paper, that table that I showed. I think he outlined some ways, but ultimately it's going to come down to money. We have to fund people. We have to build career tracks and make those career tracks, protect them to some extent from retribution from the people they're criticizing and so on. So funders can fund correction work, not just novel discovery work. Universities can hire those people. We can promote them and bring them to the top of our search committee lists and things like that. But also some of it is just the informal protection that we do by helping with networking at conferences and other ways that we help, our trainees, making sure that we're doing that and looking out for the people that are doing this kind of work, who are probably going, there's a lot of whispers behind closed doors and stuff about people doing this kind of work. So the more we can do to protect them against that and give them the advantages that others are getting, I think that's part of it too, the informal stuff, as well as money and formal positions and so on.